Okay, it is 12:03, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started here. Sorry, I'm just moving this. Okay, great. So welcome everybody to today's workshop. Today is the Community Culture and Heritage Community Grants Workshop. The purpose of this is really to go through this grant opportunity and allow you all to ask questions, to workshop your ideas, to think about how you would apply for this grant. We'll go through the application and all of the grant requirements. So, as I said, we'll give you an intro to Humanities DC. We'll go through the actual grant program. Then we'll talk to you all. We'll get some brief introductions from you and what kinds of projects you're planning. And then we'll go into components of a successful application, and we'll also talk about some common issues that we've seen, that reviewers have seen in applications in the past. And throughout, there will be opportunity for Q&A, but please do jump in if you have questions or comments. As I said, the purpose of this is really a workshop to get your thoughts and feedback. So quickly, I'll say my name is Leah Gage, and I am the Community Grants Manager at Humanities DC. I oversee, in part with my colleague Hillary, who will introduce herself in a minute, I oversee our grant portfolios, but for Community Culture and Heritage, I'm the main point of contact, and my contact info is there. So if you have questions about this grant opportunity specifically, you can reach out to me. And I'll turn it over to Hillary.
And hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Hillary Steen, and I am the other Community Grants Manager. Thank you all for being here today.
And Hillary is also an active member of the team, and you may hear from her if you reach out to the grants team with questions. And then Loy, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Loy Nemar, Director of Grant Making and Programs at Humanities DC. Glad that you all are here and interested in our grant opportunities. You're in great hands with Leah and Hillary.
Thank you. So briefly, Humanities DC, for those of you who don't know us, we're a nonprofit organization, and we are one of 56 humanities councils, state humanities councils. Obviously, DC is not a state, but we do have a humanities council. The purpose of Humanities DC is to help all Washingtonians and others connected to the district deepen their relationships with the city and each other through the sharing of unique and universal stories, the fostering of intellectual stimulation, and the promotion of cross-cultural understanding. And one of the key ways that we do this is by making grants to DC residents and organizations based in DC to carry out the humanities through, we call it community-informed grant making. I'll talk a little bit about why we call it that. To invest in local scholars, experts, organizations, as well as engaging residents through partnership-based public programming. So in 2024, we expect to make $1 million in grants. We did that in 2023. Our first cycle of grants opened December 11th and is currently open and will close February 20th. The second cycle will open March 4th and that will close May 1st. So the Community Culture and Heritage Grant is a part of this first cycle. So that application will be due February 20th. So before we go on, I want to talk about what are the humanities. And before I try to define it, I'd like to invite any of you to jump in and offer what you think your definition of the humanities is. You can do so by calling out, unmute yourself, or you can drop it in the chat. Any thoughts? So I see Olusei said, how our experiences connect together in a tapestry. Yes, exactly. I think calling out how our experiences, those human experiences, I think of the humanities as focusing on the ways that human beings are connected and express ourselves. Very good. And I hear somebody, go ahead. Okay, well, no worries. We'll move forward. So yes, I think that the responses given in the chat I see Amy just wrote sharing stories for expanded learning and perspectives. These are all really great ways to define the humanities, the key being human and stories and the expression of those. So one of the ways that we think about the humanities is how we allow and use human stories to help us as humans, as residents of DC, navigate the complexities of our past, our present, and our future. So humanities disciplines include history, anthropology, archaeology. These are things that really help capture the history of a particular place or of people. Literature, linguistics, language, art history. Those are all humanities disciplines that kind of encompass expressing stories, how we express our stories as humans. And ethics, philosophy, comparative religion, law, these are disciplines that really help examine our values as humans. And the ways in which we kind of, the rules by which we interact with one another in a way. So these are really great things to keep in mind as you're completing your application, because it is a common misconception that humanities and arts are often connected, but the humanities are not the arts. We can fund artistic expression. Arts are often a conduit to the humanities or a way of expressing the humanities. For example, you might use a theatrical performance or display to express a human story. But we don't fund the arts just for the sake of art or performance. So we may fund art criticism or art history. Again, thinking about using the arts, like using music to tell a story, using theater to tell a story that are humanistic in nature. So this is something that I just want to talk about at the outset because it's really key to helping ensure your projects are eligible for funding. So the Community Culture and Heritage Grant specifically is the purpose of this grant is to empower grassroots experts, folks in DC, to really expand support for the humanities beyond academia and formal scholarship. So we're looking to you all, DC residents, grassroots folks who have lived experience in DC to be humanists, to share your stories. And so these grants provide resources to give public voice to these stories that would interest and represent DC residents. The purpose is to document and preserve our history and culture and to highlight untold or forgotten aspects of DC history and culture. So this could look like written publications, multimedia projects like video, short videos, short documentaries, digital presentations through a website, maybe a lesson plan, exhibits or installation. One of the key components of this project, of this grant program rather, is to have a final product that's complete by the end of the grant period. So some examples of current community culture and heritage grantees, just to give you some ideas, Washington Women in Jazz Archives. This was a project put on by Washington Women in Jazz founder Amy K. Bormet. She used this grant to basically archive interviews, footage, ephemera, things that really come from the Washington Women in Jazz, and put it up on their website and make a public display. So really gathering this public DC knowledge about about women in jazz who are from DC, and then making it public. And then Artistas in the Capital, that's a podcast that was produced by Ola Cultura, which is an organization based in DC. And this is a podcast that is focusing on gathering stories from Latina and Latinx artists in DC and really sharing their perspectives and stories. So these are two really good examples of community culture and heritage projects that we have funded. So let me move on to now introductions to you all. So please take 30 seconds to give your name, your organization, if you have one, and share a little bit about your proposed project. You can do this by sharing out on your microphone, or you can drop it in the chat. Oops. Would anyone wish to share? Anyone who's commented?
Okay, I'll start.
Thank
I'm Janetta Rose Barris, and I work with Esther Productions. It's a nonprofit organization that essentially the mission is to inspire and empower girls and women who grew up without their fathers. We just got a grant and we're doing something around children's literature in March. I'm looking at this grant for possibly doing something on my own. So that's why I'm here and happy to be with all of you and hear about your organizations and what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janetta.
Hi, I'm Marvin Tupper Jones. I'm here with my fellow board member, Laurel McFarland, and
Hi.
we're from the Alliance to Preserve Civil War Defenses of Washington. Every year we host a commemoration program, all-day program about the Battle of Fort Stevens. So we focus on Civil War history for Washington, D.C. And at Fort Stevens in Northwest Washington is the only place where there was a Civil War battle. Lincoln was there, was shot at on the second and last day of the battle. And so every year we commemorate it with speeches, reenactors, education, children's, we provide for children. We have well-known speakers, musical performances. We've been doing this for about 15 years, and we are seeking funding for our 160th anniversary of the battle this coming July. And we hope that in the middle of July, probably the second or third Saturday in July, you'll all come to Fort Stevens Day. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marvin. Excellent.
Do you have anything to add, Laurel?
Just that I was excited to see in the introduction from Leah and her colleagues about telling the stories, because I think one of the things about Fort Stevens Day is it is rooted in the community, because folks from the community came out to help protect the city from the rebel attack. And so there are still people who live in Brightwood in the area. There are still folks who are reenacting to portray not just the history of the battle, but the story of the people who came together to keep the rebels from sacking and taking the city.
Hello,
Go ahead.
I'm Dave Haft, DC native here. We just finished a short film, and basically we're going to be going around providing screenings of our film Room to Breathe, providing a collective healing and reflective space for families and caregivers to essentially share their challenges together and access ongoing coaching, therapy, and support. And so as part of this grant, we're looking to develop educational materials so that we can scale, so that our team can essentially pass along what we've learned doing this work, so that educators around the region would be able to replicate it on their own without our direct support.
Great. Thank you. Olusei, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Olusei, and I'm representing myself. My project is really to capture the hidden histories of evolving neighborhoods in DC, so that others have a sense of those that have come before, and they're better able to examine their relationship to those past histories.
Great. Thank you. And Tony, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Tony Inhorn. I am representing Georgetown Heritage. We're a National Park Service Friends group working to support the C&O Canal National Historical Park in Georgetown. And our focus is really on doing educational programming to interpret the history of the canal and connect people with that history. So we're really interested in this grant to potentially support a community event that we're planning, where we'll be doing historical, educational, interpretive events for families in the area, and then also for a walking tour program that we're looking to start that will take groups along the canal. So excited to learn more and to hear about all of your projects.
Thank you. And Tiffany, you may go ahead.
Hi all, my name is Tiffany. I am here representing myself and hoping to seek funding through this grant for a project that would represent and visualize the food culture and food networks within DC, where they've been and like where they're going, how they currently are, represented through a series of cookbooks for like local neighborhoods or farmers markets that folks could access and kind of build community around.
Cool. Very cool. We
And in the chat, we have a few introductions as well. So Amy is here, and she's with the 1882 Project Foundation. So welcome, Amy. And Monica is with the DCJCC, and they're planning for their centennial celebration. And so they're thinking of creating an exhibit or project that documents the history of the DCJCC and the impact over the last 100 years. So welcome, Monica.
Fantastic. Wow. Thank you all for sharing all your projects. There will be much more opportunity later in the presentation to talk more about your projects and to really go into the application and how to apply. So we'll go ahead and move forward, but thank you all so much for jumping in and sharing. So let's talk a bit about the grant details for the Community Culture and Heritage Project. So this grant is for up to $10,000. The project period would begin May 1st, 2024 and end April 30th, and by April 30th, 2025. It could end before then. So again, applications are due February 20th. And we aim to let folks know whether they've been accepted or denied a grant in April. And those projects would be expected to start May 1st. And so again, what that would mean too is that funds would need to be spent within that project period. The actual project would need to take place within that project period. And I think those are the main things, the keys with the project period. So eligibility requirements, this is important. So this grant is open to DC-based individuals, community groups, and nonprofit organizations. So you need not have nonprofit status in order to apply for this grant. You can be an individual. You can also be a community group that may be seeking 501c3 status or is just sort of like a joint effort. However, in that case, you would need to identify one key individual to serve as the primary grantee and point of contact. But you must have a DC-based address, and you must be a DC resident, or if you're an organization, you must have a DC, the organization must reside in DC and have a DC address. So individuals may choose to apply with a fiscal sponsor. It's not a requirement for this grant, but you may choose to do so. Again, fiscal sponsors may be nonprofit organizations, but they must be based in Washington, D.C. And we have some other requirements around fiscal sponsorship, which I'm happy to talk about. I'm not going to go into it in great detail now. But the keys being you must be a DC organization and not charge more than 10% to the individual who is sponsored. And lastly, I want to say that we are expecting to give out about 9 awards, 9 community culture and heritage grants this year. Last year, we gave 10 grants in the community culture and heritage program. So, and I want to mention too that 29% of eligible applications we received last year received funding. We received other applications that were deemed ineligible, but of the eligible applications, nearly 30% were funded, to give you a sense of kind of the competitiveness. Of course, we're not sure what that will be like this year, but that gives you kind of a sense of what we had last year. So should you be successful and receive this grant, there are some key requirements that go along with this grant. So we require 2 reports, an interim report, which would be due in mid-October, October 15th. And this report really just kind of covers, gives a sense of what's been happening in the project and making sure that it's clear that your project is on track for completion. We also request a summary of spending. We don't require final documentation at that time. The final report will be due May 30th, 2025. Already looking at 2025. And that report it is much more comprehensive, and you must include documentation of all grant expenditures, including receipts, invoices, timesheets if you're paying yourself, as well as a project evaluation. The other cool thing about this grant is that if you are a grantee, you will be participating in our 2025 Community Showcase. This is a key component of this grant because this grant is really designed for individuals and grassroots folks who may not have a ready public platform. And so Humanities DC organizes an annual showcase that allows our community, culture, and heritage grantees to showcase their projects, to reach a public audience, to potentially reach other funders, to talk about their projects. This year's showcase will be taking place in February at the Anacostia Arts Center. And these are some photos from the 2022 showcase, just to give you a sense of what that looked like. So I also want to talk about allowable and unallowable expenses, because this is important. So 100% of all awarded grant funds up to $10,000 must be applied to direct program costs. So what that means is project supplies and equipment, virtual or in-person spaces. So virtual spaces, we're talking if you're doing Zoom events or if you're doing a podcast, maybe you're spending those funds on hosting. If it's an in-person space, maybe you're spending those funds to actually rent a space to host an event. You may pay for, and we encourage that you offer honoraria to your participants. If you have speakers, panelists, folks you're interviewing for a documentary, all of these things, we strongly encourage you to pay people for their valuable time. So that's honoraria. You may also pay yourself as a project director. That would be put in under wages and salary. You may pay for transportation if you're going to and from places and interviewing folks or reaching other folks. Transportation is allowable, as well as publicity and promotion, because one of the keys to this project is bringing the humanities to the public. And so we want you to do that through marketing, whether that's paying for social media posts or putting an ad, whatever makes sense. We cannot fund rent or utilities or indirect overhead costs, office supplies that are sort of general. If it's specific to the project, like if you're printing things out for the project, that's allowable. But if you're an organization applying for this grant and you're just sort of generally paying for office supplies that may not be used in the project itself, that would not be an allowable expense. We can't pay for food or refreshments, fundraising. We cannot pay for re-granting or funding to government agencies, and just generally any non-program related costs or expenses that are unrelated to the execution of the project. So I see that I have a couple questions in here. Amy, I see that you've raised your hand, so go ahead, please.
Yes, so I understand that the funds need to be used for direct programs. Now, for the ones that cannot be funded, can we supplement that from something else? And okay, so the reason why I ask is, so like some of the activities that we do, we might have like at a restaurant, or a cafe or something like that.
Mhm.
And that's to attract attendance. But the funds would probably or most likely be used to pay for the videographer, the editor, things like that.
Exactly. Yep, that sounds exactly right. So yes, we know food is a really great way to encourage people to come to your events and encourage you to find other ways to pay for that. When we go into the application, I'll show you there's a spot in the budget where you can enter additional costs that may not be covered by this grant, but could be covered either by yourself or other funding sources.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we move forward? This is actually, I have opportunity for Q&A put in here, so please feel free. Okay. Well, let me move forward to talk about components of a successful application, because this could raise some questions. Whoops. Okay, there we go. So we want to talk about components of what has made of applications that have been successful in the past. So these are things that we've gone through and looked at what successful applications had as a part of their proposals. So going back to this humanities focus, thinking about the definition of humanities and thinking about the humanities disciplines that we mentioned, this is really key. So the project utilizes the humanities to publicly explore human stories, culture, and experiences. So making sure that you're really rooted, that there's a spot in the application to mention which humanities disciplines you will be focusing on. We ask that you list one primary discipline. So again, thinking about anthropology, history, literature, linguistics, art history, art criticism, comparative religion, all of these disciplines as methods to explore human stories. You'd want to make sure that you're really thinking about how your project fits in there. Another key component is the scholar or community expert. So the Community Culture and Heritage Grant requires that you have an advisor who is a community expert or humanities scholar who advises your project and ensures that it's rooted in the humanities and rooted in the community. And so they should be identified by name, and their expertise should be relevant to the project. We can talk more about this humanities scholar piece, but this could be somebody that you're already partnering with. If you're doing a project that is, so for example, Ola Cultura, we talked about their podcast. They had their humanities scholar was somebody who really understood storytelling through podcasts and had experience in the DC arts scene, and so could really speak to the audience that was being targeted through that project. So again, it doesn't need to be an academic scholar per se. It could be, certainly, but really somebody whose expertise can really guide and advise your project. Another key component is very detailed project narrative. So thinking about what, making sure that the narrative explains what you're doing, who you're doing it for, who your target audience is, how you will actually carry it out, and why it's important to carry out, why it's key to DC. We always say that you should assume that the reviewers don't know anything about your project, your organization, or your topic. So being as detailed as possible is really key. And with that, the timeline should also be detailed and realistic. So there's a place in the application to go through your timeline and think about what dates you want to achieve certain things, when you expect to have certain pieces completed, making sure this feels realistic to you, and that you have specific dates as possible and steps toward completion. Also, making sure that community partners are identified and that the applicant can show how the community will really strengthen their project. So again, these are really supposed to be DC-based projects. We want this to really, it to be clear that this will benefit DC, that it's telling a DC story, that even if the scope has some kind of national implications or international implications, the focus really needs to be on the DC community. And so having specific community partners that you're working with, or folks that will be part of your project who are DC based, will really help make that apparent in your application. And then lastly, having clear outreach plans that identify your targets. So we talked a bit about, I mentioned an allowable cost being publicity and marketing, thinking about how your outreach will really reach your target, what that outreach will look like, and how specific you are in your application. I think the more specific you can be will really strengthen that. Okay, so I'm checking here. I see, yep, thank you for answering that question, Hillary. We had the question, can equipment include things such as video cameras for documentary projects, printers, and exhibit for art projects? Yes, that's a perfectly allowable expense. So on the other side, thinking of what made applications maybe less successful, this is really a mirror of what we just talked about. So common application issues that we see, key personnel are not specifically identified. So maybe it's unclear who your team is. who you're working with to make something happen. Something like a documentary, that requires a lot of folks. It requires videographers, it requires editors. And so if those folks aren't at least mentioned and identified, that could maybe make the reviewers think that the project hasn't been fully fleshed out. And additionally, the humanities scholar is not identified. You really should know who that advisor, that community expert or humanities scholar will be. There's a place in the application to mention them by name, to include their resume or a description of their work. So making sure to know that in advance is key. Also, project narrative does not provide enough detail. Again, making sure that you're really explaining each component of the project, having a specific timeline, and also making sure that it fits within that grant period. So May 1st, 24 to April 30, 25. Community collaboration information isn't specific. Either that means the partners haven't been identified, or it's really unclear how they will contribute, or maybe it's mentioned, but it's not clear that they will, that they're actually going to be active participants. And then the budget line items are not clearly justified. So there's an area in the budget where you can really talk about the narrative of the budget, explain why you're spending certain amounts. If you have a high amount in the salaries category, that's okay, but explain why. Explain why you think you need to pay yourself or the project director so much. If you have a lot in equipment, say, you need to explain that, well, we want to have a video camera and we want to have a recorder and all these things. So really just being detailed in your budget will ensure that the reviewers understand what they're looking at. Okay, so that was a lot of information. I'm going to stop there briefly. I'm going to stop sharing because I want to pull up the application and see if I have any questions coming up from folks.
Yes, I raised my hand.
Marvin, I didn't see. Go ahead.
Thank you. Does the project director have to be a District of Columbia resident?
So, okay, if you're an organization, if you're applying on behalf of an organization, which I know you are, and the organization is based in DC, but the project director themselves is an employee of the organization, but does not live in DC, I believe that they would still be eligible to be the project director. As long as that's, again, very clear that the project is focused on DC and that the organization itself is based in DC.
So the organization has to be based in DC. Our organization is based in DC, but we may need to use a Maryland address. Is that an issue?
Why? So if the organization is based in DC, meaning the organization, can you explain a little bit more?
Well, it's hypothetical, but not really actual. Our bank account is a DC address. Everything is a DC address. It's just for mailing purposes. It may anything may go to Maryland.
So when you're applying as an organization, there will be a place where you need to enter the organization's address, and that address must be in DC.
Okay, that pretty much means I'm stuck with the job then. Okay, thank you. I'm trying to palm it off to my colleague.
I mean, we actually, you bring up an interesting point with like who can really work on a project and who can work on the application. And I mean, we do encourage you to, like, if you have an organization or even other potential partners, to have them involved in writing the application and doing the work. I mean, everything really should be focused on DC, like Leah has been saying. But if you want to work with someone to actually write the application, you're totally welcome to do that.
All right, thank you.
Alice, I see you asked on the RFP, it states that an applicant is able to get feedback on the proposal by submitting it in more than a week in advance. Do you recommend that we submit it sooner than that or request office hours for feedback? Great question. So yes, we definitely recommend that you submit it sooner if possible. So for us, Hillary and I are available to review draft applications before the submission deadline. We request that they're submitted at least 1 week in advance, but of course, if you can submit them earlier, we'll have more time to review and more time to offer you feedback. And so you can do that in a number of ways. Definitely requesting office hours is fine. You can also just email us. I'm going to go into the application now and I will show you what that looks like, but there's a way to enter all the information in the application and then save it as a draft. And that way it's available for us to see. We can see it in the back end without you having yet submitted it.
And usually when people submit a draft for us to review, we do like having a call with the applicant to talk about the draft submission. But obviously if schedules don't align, we can also provide feedback over email.
Yep, exactly. So I want to show you all the application and talk through it, and then also talk through the review criteria, because we have all of the weighted review criteria in the application itself. So this is the application. I didn't go through the process of creating a Foundant account, but Foundant is the program that we use to submit your application. And I'm going to show you on our website here, if you go to the grant opportunities page and then scroll down here to applicant resources, you can see Foundant instructions. And this will give you detailed instructions on how to create a Foundant account if you don't already have one. It's a relatively simple process. We definitely, though, know that creating extra accounts, doing all these things, can put up barriers. And so we want to do as much as we can and make sure that it's easy. So these instructions should be fairly detailed. If you have issues creating a Foundant account, don't hesitate to reach out to us. If you think your organization already has a Foundant account, we strongly, strongly encourage you to not create a new one. If you're not sure how to log into your Foundant account, that's okay. Just reach out to us and we can give you those details. If you've applied for a grant in the past, then likely you have a Foundant account, and so we can help you find it if you reach out to us. So this grant page too, I just want to point out, obviously we have all of the different grant opportunities here, but then we also list the workshops and info sessions that we have coming up. And then there was a question about office hours. There's a link to sign up for office hours. That would be with myself or Hillary. Those are 20 to 30-minute sessions in which you have one-on-one time with one of us to discuss your project. But let's take a look at the application. And let me pull up my notes, just to make sure. Okay. So this is the Community Culture and Heritage application. Right here at the top, we talk about the review process. I'm going to move these over so you can see everything. So the review process is that we engage with community-based reviewers. All of our reviewers are external to Humanities DC. Staff does not review or make decisions on grants, nor does the board. These are all individuals are encouraged to apply to be grant reviewers, and I would encourage you all to do the same. You may apply for a grant and be a grant reviewer in the same cycle. You just wouldn't be reviewing the program to which you applied. But being a grant reviewer is a really great way to see the process and to get a sense of what makes for a successful application. And grant reviewers do receive a stipend of $250 each cycle that they review. So this process takes 2 to 3 weeks. Reviewers spend about 16 hours. We estimate reviewing applications and then meeting together to discuss applications. Want to point out here, this is where you would enter your applicant information. when you register for a Fountain account, you'll be indicating who you are and who you're applying on behalf of. So if you're applying on behalf of an organization, you would want to be making sure that you've selected organization. If you're applying as an individual, you would select individual, and that will bring up different information at the bottom. Indicate where you're based, and we ask that you indicate how you learned about Humanities DC in this opportunity. If you have any previous experience with us, you are invited to enter that here, but it's not required, and it's also not reviewed by reviewers. So this will not influence whether you get a grant. It's really information for us internally. I want to call this piece out. So if you're applying as an individual, entering your individual statement of interest and really highlighting your motivations and why you're applying. If you select organization, then instead you'll be entering an organization profile that includes the mission statement, a history of the organization, and how this project may contribute to your organization's mission. We ask for the organization's annual budget and the number of employees, because this, the number of employees will determine accessibility requirements, and the unique entity identifier. So this is a UEI number. This is a number that we use to determine, this is actually a federal government number that's used to determine eligibility. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail about the UEI, but there is more information on our website under FAQ to talk about that. And I'm also happy to talk about that offline. And I see a question here from Amy, so I'm going to go ahead.
Yeah, so about the number of full-time employees, are you strict with employees in the definition of W-2s, or 1099s are okay? And that's contractor versus actual employee, because we do have staff who are full-time, but they're not being paid on a W-2. And by IRS definition, employee is they get a W-2.
That's a great question. My instinct is to say that this question is really asking for W-2 employees. However, I would go ahead, let me get back to you, Amy, and make sure that that information is correct. Based on what this says here, I would go ahead and put the number of full-time employees that are at your organization, whether or not they're contractors or actual employees. And but before you submit your application, we can confirm that for you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, because we just define as staff. So we don't differentiate employees or contractors, and that, you know, doesn't confuse things. But we do have full-time staff members.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So moving on. So again, fiscal sponsor, we talked a bit about that. I want to call this out because if you are an individual who plans to apply through a fiscal sponsor, make sure that the information entered here reflects the fiscal sponsor, because they will be the grantee. So you would, in that case, select organization. And this question here, is this organization serving as the fiscal sponsor? You would click yes. And then that will open up an additional section to just enter information about the sponsored entity. So that individual or informal organization that's being sponsored. Okay, so then I want to talk about the next section. So those sections are not scored as such, but the first section that really gets a score is the capacity and key personnel. So this is worth 30% of the total score of your application. And what reviewers are looking for here is that the project director is experienced and can bring this project to fruition. The humanities scholar or community expert has relevant expertise, and that other team members identified are clearly their roles are clearly defined and explained. So this is the second largest score piece of the application. So it's a pretty important piece. The project director, if you're
Can I
applying.
ask a question now, or will you have a?
Go ahead.
Um, that particular area where you're scoring 30%, for is it also 30% for an individual if an individual is applying, given that it is just that particular person? So there's no project director. They're the project director. They're everything. So how does that work?
Yeah, so the way that that works is that the reviewers will be looking at the project director to make sure that they have the expertise and experience. Even if you're applying as an individual, you will still need to identify a humanities scholar or community expert. And so that will be considered, as well as any other team members or collaborators. So even if you're an individual, if you're doing a community-based project, if you are using humanities disciplines, then the chances are you'll be working with other people or other organizations, other partners. And so being able to call that out as much as possible will, I think, make for a strong section here. It is still 30% if you're applying as an individual, but of course they'll be looking at it differently than if it's like a larger organization. That said, this grant opportunity is really designed for individuals and smaller organizations. So even if an organization has a 501c3, they might be a smaller community-based organization. So it will still be scored the same.
Okay, thank you.
Also, really quickly, individual applicants are usually almost always the project director, but not necessarily. It is possible to be an individual applicant and someone else is a project director too.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, the project director, if you're applying as an individual, right? Yeah, you will most likely be entering that information here. And also the project director will most likely be the primary point of contact. However, they may not be. So that will be something to consider. There is a question here where you can answer that. But you'd be entering this information about the project director and upload a resume. If you don't have a resume, you can upload some other kind of description of your past experience and work. Team and collaborators. So back to this question of, if you're applying as an individual, what does that look like? As I said, hopefully there will be some kind of collaboration in the community or some other folks that you'd be working with. This is the place to really identify that, to identify other organizations that may be influencing your project, other individuals in the organization that you're working with, etc. So really being specific about identifying those team members and their experience. And then lastly, the humanities scholar or community expert. Does anybody have specific questions around the humanities scholar or community expert? Or does anybody have willing to offer who they think might be their humanities scholar or community expert for their project?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I'd like to. We have one well-known author on our subject who would serve as a community scholar very well. He's a PhD and teaches at the War College. But we also have a lot of board members who have lectured about Fort Stevens, the battle, the Civil War, as well. I produced a documentary about the African-American woman who owned the land that Fort Stevens is on. And I've lectured about the Civil War and other history. Well, we have several board members I think would qualify.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a number of those folks would definitely qualify.
Okay, thank you.
Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious how kind of formal the qualifications need to be for the humanities scholar. slash community expert.
They don't need to be formal in the sense of having, you know, a title or work experience. I think it really will depend on your project. But those qualifications will really reflect the topic, or rather the topic, what your project is focused on, the community it's focused on, the topic should be reflected in that humanities scholars experience. If that's, yeah. Go ahead, Oluseyi.
Yes, so I've been doing some questioning since the last time we spoke, and I was advised that perhaps in addition to the Historical Society of Washington, like a good way to also go would be to reach out to the neighborhood commissions. And I'm just curious to see what your thoughts on that.
Definitely. Yeah. I think if you're working on a project, you know, you had mentioned your project is really thinking about the forgotten narratives of DC neighborhoods. So, you know, neighborhood ANCs, neighborhood commissions can often be great wealths of resources. And if they're not, if the commissioners themselves are not experts in the community, chances are they will know community folks who might be really good people for your project. So I think that's a great place to start as well. And just calling out this question here, there should just be one community expert or humanities scholar. So if you wish to enter additional folks who are going to support your project, there's room for that here in the team and collaborators, as well as down below on the community portion, which I'll talk about in a bit, but there should be one identified humanities scholar.
And also with the scholar, the project director or the applicant can also be the project scholar. Just like if you list someone else, you do need to describe and explain as to why potentially you would be the best scholar, but that is allowed. So don't feel the need to absolutely have someone external for this.
That's right. Well, great. So I'm going to continue and start talking about the project narrative. So project narrative, this is the section of the application that is worth the most in the Community Culture and Heritage Grant. This is 40% of your application. And this is really where you're describing the project and how you will carry it out. So the applicant has provided a clear and detailed description of the proposed project and the activities to get there. The audience experience of and participation in the project is explained. The timeline is within the grant period and is feasible, and the goals seem achievable and impacts are described. So this is, you know, this section, if you have additional, you know, if you have limited time to focus on a particular section, would be the section to do so. Of course, the whole application will be reviewed, but this is kind of the bulk of where you will describe what it is you're doing and how you're doing it. So, you know, making sure that you've identified a humanities discipline. And again, I mentioned this is really where you should identify the primary humanities discipline. You will have, you can list secondary disciplines, but really think about what discipline your project is rooted in. Then you should also enter the project type. So we have several different project types based on the past types of projects that we funded. Of course, you can enter other if there's something that you think does not fit within these guidelines, or you can select all that apply. But we really ask that you explain. And again, being as detailed as possible is always the best way to move forward. You should explain why you've chosen the certain humanities disciplines that you've chosen, why you think that they are the right disciplines to help you carry out this project. And so, okay, wait, I should say the project summary. So this is just a very, very brief summary. So this might be used for external purposes. If you move down here, this is really where you're going to be describing in much greater detail those project steps and the humanities discipline. Yeah, so again, so providing a very detailed timeline, being as specific as possible. Offering dates is always great. If you can't offer specific dates, that's fine. You can say like within 1 month, we will have achieved this. By the next month, we plan to do this. So being very specific will show the reviewers that you've thought through, how am I going to actually complete this project? You can also upload a visual representation of the timeline if that's easier. And then this piece, connection to the humanities. So I want to highlight this because we thought about how to word this question a lot this year. So describe how your project will connect to and utilize the humanities disciplines that you've selected above. We've listed six different questions here, bulleted here, to help you think through this. You don't need to answer all of these questions, but these are some questions that may help you think about how this is a humanities project. So trying to think about how you would answer these questions will help you make clear this connection to the humanities. And I can tell you that reviewers in the past have been very concerned with this, like making sure that these projects are in fact humanities projects, that they're connected to the humanities. So thinking about this question carefully will help strengthen your application. Are there any questions around this question specifically right now, or anything else that we've just talked about? Okay, I'm going to keep moving forward. Jump in if you have thoughts or questions. Measuring success. So describing your goals and what it is that you will use to define a successful project. Any data like the number of people who you hope attend the screening of your film, or, you know, is it, are you collecting surveys? I mean, that is something that I think reviewers like to see, how that you've thought about how you're defining your success and how you're measuring it. So as best you can, thinking about how you'll understand the impact of your project.
That impact, once it's complete, that you'll have a survey or something to go along with your viewing or your display or your outcome?
Yeah, a survey is not required, but it is definitely a tool that can be used to help measure that impact. But yes, when we're talking about the goal, the impact, we're thinking about at the end of this project or throughout the completion of this project, what is the impact? How will you know that this project achieved its goals and was successful? Okay, so I'm going to keep moving forward. So the next section of the application is this community collaboration piece. This is worth 20% of the score. And the proposal should describe an effective plan for reaching and engaging the target audience, and also will be inclusive, diverse, equitable, and accessible, defined broadly to include a very diverse group of folks in many different categories, and any explanations for exceptions to this are provided. So these questions here are really thinking about the community involvement, how you're involving the DC community, or if not DC community, if you're thinking neighborhood focused, if you're thinking about a certain demographic of DC, how those folks are influencing and informing your project, and how they're strengthening your project as well. I think that that's something that really can help make a strong proposal, is thinking about this community piece. And then the outreach strategy and community engagement, really thinking about who your target audience is, who you want to reach with this. Is it a very broad audience, or is it like a really specific audience, or relatively specific audience that you think will benefit from or resonate with this project? I think as much as you can be specific about your target audience, and again, up here in the project narrative, there's an opportunity to enter I want to find it. Yeah, there's an opportunity to kind of describe, or rather, show who the audience demographics will be. And then down here, you're talking about the outreach strategy to engage with that target audience. Any questions around this section before I move on to the budget?
I just want to say really quickly that if your project has a very narrow scope or a very narrow audience or a geographic area, that's totally fine. You do not have to have a project that is really going to service all 8 wards of the city or people of all ages. So don't feel the need to expand your project beyond the bounds that you would like.
Definitely, definitely. Okay, well, we'll talk about the budget here. So this piece is worth 10% of the total score, but it's really important. And we've seen applications that might have been successful up until this point miss a couple points because their budget wasn't done in the correct way. So the budget, what reviewers are looking for is that they've clearly, found it will do that if you haven't been active in the system for a couple of minutes. So just be aware of that. Okay, so the budget should be, sorry, here we go. The applicant has clearly described how the funds will be used, and all expenses are tied to the proposed project. Pretty key information here. As we talked earlier about allowable and unallowable costs, making sure that all of your expenses are related to the project. And then the second piece, that they're allowable. So making sure you've looked at that request for proposal and looked at the details in there about allowable and unallowable costs. This presentation will be available, and you can see the bullet points that I indicated earlier, but really make sure to review the RFP to get a full look at all of the allowable and unallowable costs. So this budget table, we've tried to keep it as simple as possible. This first column here is where you would enter the amounts that would be utilized by the Humanities DC grant. So again, this is up to a $10,000 grant. So you would want this number down here, which will automatically total this column to be at $10,000 or under. You don't have to request the full amount, but most people do. Honoraria, this is where you would enter the amount that you expect to pay folks that are participating in your project, whether those are panelists, speakers, interviewees, advisors, people who are participating in your project to receive an honoraria. We encourage you to enter that information here. And we say that speakers and panelists and folks who receive honoraria should receive at least $200 for their time. But you are welcome to set that amount as you see fit. Salary and wages, this would be where you would enter the cost of paying yourself if you wish to do that as the project director, as well as other folks who are participating in the project directly. So this would be where you would probably enter, if you're creating a film, the videographer's payment. If you are doing a podcast, this would be where you would enter sort of the audio engineer's information, their payment information. Travel, this would be thinking about how much you'd be spending on getting to the different locations necessary for your project. This may or may not be a component of your project if it's mostly virtual. Supplies, you're thinking about, the actual equipment, the things that you need to carry out the project. Publicity and promotion, thinking about how you will market your project or the outreach strategy. If you have facilities, this is where you would enter, we talked about earlier, virtual versus in-person facilities or hosting. If you have expenses related to evaluation, so let's say you decide you want to have a survey and you want to hand the survey out in paper at the end of your event, you might enter that here. Maybe you're working with somebody to help you develop the survey, you could enter that here as well. And then other costs, you can enter that here as well. So once you enter these numbers here, you'll see it will automatically total down here. So this total is automatic. Again, making sure that this is $10,000 or under. Now, this column here, cost share, this is not a required piece. You do not have to have matching funds to receive a Community Culture and Heritage grant. But if you do have other costs associated with the project that are either unallowable by the Humanities DC grant, or you just know that your budget will be more than $10,000 and you have additional sources of funding, this is where you can enter those costs here. Again, it's not required, but if you do have those sources, we like to see it, and reviewers will take that into consideration that, okay, they've got additional funding and they've looked that through and they can see, okay, even though this project seems like it's going to cost more than $10,000, they know where that money is going to be coming from. And then the budget narrative. So I really want to highlight the budget narrative to really explain all of your costs up here. Obviously, when you put salary and wages here, you put $1,000 there. It's not, you're not explaining what that is. So really telling the reviewers, well, this is meant to go toward the project director, and this is why, and we anticipate they will spend this number of hours completing this project, and that's why we are putting this number here. Being as specific as possible. We know we want to interview 10 people, and that's why, we've entered $2,000 in honoraria, because we think that that's what it's going to cost to have those interviewees. If you have things in the other category, you definitely want to explain them, because the reviewers will be looking for that. So again, using this budget narrative to explain this table up here. Any questions around the budget?
I just want to emphasize around the budget, as people are thinking of questions for this. We find that this part of the application is typically the most intimidating for potential applicants, especially if you're a really small organization or an individual who's never done a budget before. And so just to emphasize that the budget that you submit in your application is a plan. It is okay if you don't have the absolute final numbers in time for the budget submission. You would be, if you get funded, you would be able to redirect funds around your budget if need be, because things happen. So just be aware that for the budget in the application, it is your best guess, fully understanding that things might change, and that is totally fine. The key here for this section is really the budget narrative piece, to really explain in as much detail as possible how you got to the numbers that you have.
Great point. Yep.
I have a question. Will we need to upload any more official documentation or a spreadsheet outlining the budget, or is this component that you're showing us the only numbers that we'll have to enter?
These are the numbers that you have to enter. There's no additional budget that you need to upload for the application. If you have additional things, you can do so. You can upload them in the appendix, but it's not required. And really, the reviewers are going to be looking to make sure that this information entered here is complete and is supported by this budget narrative section here. So as I just mentioned, the appendix. So then there's this section we call the appendix. So this is where you can include supporting documents if you wish. This is not required, but if you have letters of support from community partners, if you have site agreements, other project team member resumes, etc., you can upload them in these sections here. There's also an opportunity to enter additional information just using a text field here. As well, I should say that if you are hosting a festival or a public event, you will need to enter information about accessibility. So these questions will not actually be reviewed by our reviewers. So it's really just for us internally to understand that you've been thinking about this. Also, if you're applying as an organization and you have 15 employees or more, these are legally required, meeting ADA requirements. So if you're hosting an event, you'll want to enter, or or if you meet that that threshold of 15 employees or more, you need to be sure that your project is ADA compliant. And you'll want to enter kind of your accessibility plans here and really thinking through these pieces. So describing your plan, your compliance with ADA, and then also though other things that you're thinking about, even if you're not required, even if you don't have 15 employees or more, will you be having a public event, and will you be thinking about accessibility? Will you be including an ASL interpretation? Will you be making sure that the event is accessible to people who are differently abled?
And I do want to say regarding the accessibility space, like Leah said, not all of you will be required to submit this section, but we do encourage all applicants to think about accessibility in whatever definition you would like. So if you not even an event, but really any kind of project, like how will you be able to reach audiences with different accommodation needs perhaps, or you just want to bring your project out to the broadest audience possible. So even if you don't have to actually answer this question, just something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And then lastly, you have your signature. So this is an electronic signature. Of course, it's not a wet signature, but this would be the signature of the person submitting the application. So if you're using a fiscal sponsor, the fiscal sponsor representative would need to sign this application. If you're submitting as an individual, you would be the one submitting the application. You can always save your application. I mentioned this, you can save your draft. This message will pop up. This is not required. It's just a message from Foundant. And your application has been saved. Of course, it's letting me know all of these required questions were not answered. And so that's okay because it's a draft. But then your application will be in draft status and you can come back to it and edit it. And if it's complete and you feel like it's ready for review by the staff, you can email one of us and let us know, hey, my application's ready for review. Can you please take a look? And we will try to get back to you within a week, hopefully less. And so that is the application. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and return to gallery view and see if this has raised any other questions.
I did get some private questions that I can share for the whole group. There's a question about if key personnel have to be all DC residents. And the answer to that is no. Your key personnel that you list don't all have to be DC residents. You would just have to explain how and why they're part of the project. Yeah, so that's not a requirement. And then the second question, which I have not had a chance to respond, asked about if you have a community viewing or event, do you have to have the venue specifically identified? or is it okay to list several locations that you are thinking of? And the answer to that is that you don't need to have a location formally secured yet, but you should talk about potential options if you are that far in the planning process.
I see a question here. Can we apply as an individual for this grant for our specific project and for the vision grant through a fiscal sponsor for another project? So I think in this case, the way you describe it, Alice, I think probably no, simply because you would still be the primary project person for the Visions grant as well as the Community Culture and Heritage grant. If you want to reach out, we can talk offline about kind of what you have in mind. But really, so this raises the point, which I don't think I mentioned, that applicants may only apply for one grant per cycle. So we have 4 grant opportunities open this cycle, Community Culture and Heritage being one, and you may only apply for one per cycle. So we can talk a little bit about what you're thinking there, but I would strongly encourage you to focus on one grant opportunity. If the fiscal sponsor relationship is, a completely separate project that the fiscal sponsor is kind of running, or it has a relationship to, then it might fit. But I would encourage you to reach out directly with more questions about that. Go ahead, Tony.
If we're applying for support for a project that's more focused on planning and designing for a later deliverable, in the portion about community engagement in the audience, would we want to focus on describing what the audience will be once the project is completed, or is there another approach we should take?
I think so right, we talked a little bit about this, I know, over office hours. So if the end product in this case is a plan or a curriculum, which I think kind of fits, then I think if you can demonstrate that you're the part of the development of this project is working with understanding the target audience by engaging with them directly, whether that's through representatives or what have you, that is informing your project, I think that would be how you'd want to frame that, in addition to the other collaboration pieces. Yeah, I hope I've answered that.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? So as I said, this has been recorded and is being recorded. And once we have the session complete, we'll be uploading this to our YouTube page and linking it to our website so that you can review and also share it with anybody else that you might think would benefit from this.
The biggest piece of advice that I offer to potential applicants is to be as detailed as possible. Assume that the people who will really be reading through your application, they have no idea what your topic is, what your organization does, anything like that. So explain all acronyms, explain all slang terms, and that's really where it would be helpful to have someone else read your application before you submit. But having answers as detailed as possible really does go a long way.
I have a quick question that Alice kind of could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the key differences between this grant and the Vision grant, given that they both kind of allow for some public events?
Yes. So one of the key differences between these grants is the amount. So the Visions grant is a $25,000 grant. Community Culture and Heritage is a $10,000 grant. The Visions grant is open to DC-based organizations, Individuals may apply, but they must apply through a fiscal sponsor, whereas community culture and heritage, an individual may apply. So one of the, the purpose, I talked a bit at the outset about the purpose of this grant is to provide a public platform to community-based scholars, to community-based experts, to really bring that community humanities to the public sphere. Visions, the purpose behind that, the intention with that larger grant amount and with those eligibility requirements, that grant is often intended for maybe applicants who have a bit more infrastructure, formal planning, and might have, one of the key differences being that the budget is so much larger. And so if there's a larger project that requires a larger budget, that could be a bigger fit. The other thing is thinking about the audience. So community culture and heritage might have a smaller, more targeted audience. The project may be focusing on a smaller, geographically smaller, or the size of the community might be smaller, whereas Visions might be kind of thinking about a broader audience. We funded larger feature documentary films, multi-day festivals that are aimed at a broader public. Those are some key differences between those two grants. And I'll invite Hillary to jump in as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. CCH is really grassroots focused, whereas Visions is broader focused.
Great, thank you.
With the full understanding that, like, if you want to do an event that theoretically could work in either CCH or Visions, again, think of like how expansive you want that event to be. Is it a one-off thing for one day that focuses on one particular street? Or are you hoping for like a big media festival that will be over several days? So there's definitely a fine line. So it really depends on how large your event will be. And we encourage you that if you're thinking between CCH and Visions, to sign up for office hours, and we can provide some suggestions for which direction to go to. And later this week, we'll be doing this kind of workshop for Visions, if any of you would like to also sign up for that workshop.
Great. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left on the schedule. If there are no additional comments, questions, again, I will invite you to read the RFP on our website, to visit humanitiesdc.org and go to grant opportunities. That will that grant opportunities page will give you kind of the link to all the resources that you need and take you to the RFPs. I really thank you all for your time today. This has been really fruitful discussion. I feel like I've learned a lot about your projects, and hope that this has been helpful as you're thinking about completing the application. Our goal is to demystify this grant process as much as possible and make it accessible. So we are here and continue to be here to do that for you. Okay, well, thank you all so much for being here, and I hope you all stay dry on this rainy day in January, and look forward to hearing more from you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.